This is a common human story. This is the story of a people who rose up in a non-violent revolution in Sudan and in the global Sudanese diaspora to demand a competent, democratic, civilian government that delivers freedom, peace, and justice in the face of crackdowns, violence, and an all-out war between two military rivals that have caused unprecedented harm to the Sudanese state, economy, and civilian life. This is a story of possibility, one inspired by art, music, and a stubborn, joyful insistence to celebrate life. My name is Amir Ahmad Nasr. I'm a writer and a journalist, and I'm here to break down the story of the Sudanese Revolution and what it means for you and the world. For 30 years, Sudan was ruled by the military dictator Omar al-Bashir. This was the longest anyone has ruled the Sudanese state. Bashir took control of the country in 1989 after leading a successful military coup that toppled a democratically elected government. This wasn't necessarily surprising. Up until that point, Sudan had a history of periodic military coups. For this reason, Bashir decided to avoid a similar fate. So he played powerful forces against each other to protect himself and make sure no one was strong enough to take him out. Until the Sudanese people's persistent December 2018 revolution. Bashir panicked. This was a protest movement bigger than anything he had ever seen. Even though he expected to be protected by his security and armed forces, two players had other plans. The first is the Sudanese Armed Forces, or SAF, which was taken over and led by General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, a longtime member of the institution. The second is the Rapid Support Forces, or RSF, led by Mohamed Hamdan Dagalo, known as Hemedti, an ambitious militia fighter who had a meteoric rise. The SAF is Sudan's official national army. It is the army of the people, and it includes the branches of the Navy and the Air Force. The RSF is a paramilitary group that grew out of the Janjaweed militia groups west of the country. Hemedti heavily recruited nomadic Arab clans, many of whom espouse an Arab supremacist ideology, including from outside Darfur in Chad, Niger, and Mali. In 2003, a rebellion broke out here in Darfur. People in this region were marginalized and suffered poverty and government neglect for years. While the SAF was tied up in a civil war in the south, Bashir relied on the local Janjaweed Arab clan militias to put down the mostly non-Arab African rebellion in Darfur. The Janjaweed, along with the armed forces, wiped out entire villages, committing genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Impressed by their ruthless efficiency, Bashir later recognized the Janjaweed as an official paramilitary force called the Rapid Support Forces, promoting Hemedti to be its leader and placing him under his command. By then, the International Criminal Court had issued an arrest warrant for Bashir to try him for the genocide and crimes against humanity committed in Darfur. Later, Bashir put the RSF in competition with the SAF for his protection with promises of power and government spoils. Indeed, Hemedti and his forces would end up seizing a gold mine in western Sudan, which he used to enrich himself and fund his rise. While Bashir was busy dividing and ruling, the country's economy began to collapse and civilians suffered increasingly due to his nepotism and vast corruption. This became much worse when the civil war in the south ended with the separation of South Sudan in 2011, taking with it the oil fields that has sustained the economy of the country. Frustrated with these conditions, people took to the streets in waves upon waves of peaceful protests and charitable volunteer efforts. By December 2018, a group called the Resistance Committees, along with professional workforce associations, became the main revolutionary leaders spearheading the protests, uniting all kinds of people across Sudanese society to demand that Bashir step down. the resistance committees emerged as growing decentralized grassroots neighborhood networks across the country, which made it hard for the security forces to crack down on them successfully. The resistance committees became a formidable nonviolent revolutionary force for change that gained increasing global admiration and recognition as the vanguard of Sudan's democratic aspirations for competent, democratic civilian rule. This was the sort of thing that Bashir had prepared for when he surrounded himself with the SAF and RSF as well as other security groups. At first, the SAF and RSF violently cracked down on peaceful protesters across Sudan and in the capital city of Khartoum. But protesters kept up the pressure, month after month after month, despite loss of life and injuries. Evidently, it became clear to the SAF and RSF that Bashir was not useful to them anymore. On April 11, 2019, they removed him from power following Sudan's legacy of military coups. But the nationwide protest movement of millions didn't stop. Protesters certainly did not want more brutal and corrupt military rule. After all, during the revolution, one of the main protest chants was the military back to the barracks and the Janjaweed dissolved. The people demanded a unified professional army that serves and protects the country. With lots of pressure from protesters and from external actors and allies, Burhan and Hemedti agreed to form a transitional council led by Burhan as chair and Hemedti as vice chair. The plan was to hand over power from the military to a civilian government within an agreed-upon time frame. At the beginning, the council followed the plan and appointed a civilian prime minister, Abdullah Hamdok, a respected economist, to lead a cabinet of technocrats and steer the country out of crisis to free and fair elections. Despite the arrangement, it did not last. On October 25, 2021, the Sudanese military, led by Burhan, and the RSF, led by Hemedti, removed the civilian cabinet in another military coup. Soon, it became clear to Hamdok that he was meant to play a symbolic role as a friendly civilian face, while the SAF and RSF kept real authority and control over the decisions steering the country. Eventually, Hamdok resigned in January 2022, making Burhan the de facto leader of Sudan, and unsurprisingly, fueling a new persistent round of revolutionary protests. Hemedti, on the other hand, wasn't happy with playing Burhan's number two. He had barely secret aspirations of becoming Sudan's new ruler. As the two men's interests started to publicly diverge, a brewing rivalry emerged. Meanwhile, protesters kept up the pressure on Burhan and Hemedti to credibly and genuinely transition to a civilian government. But the two men focused on building their personal affiliations with allies, regionally and globally. This was a deliberate strategy to strengthen their positions to gain legitimacy. Each of them wanted to show he is suitable to rule Sudan next. On April 13, 2023, Hemedti's men began positioning themselves near a crucial SAF fighter jet base despite SAF's warnings to reverse course. Then on April 15th, the RSF used the element of surprise to launch an offensive directly against Burhan and his guards in Sudan's capital of Khartoum, a city with a diverse civilian population of 5 million. Burhan's military responded with airstrikes and full mobilization. After Hemedti's series of attacks failed to kill or remove the SAF leadership, his RSF mutiny unleashed a heinous campaign of genocidal violence, targeting innocent civilians on a scale never seen before. The RSF expelled thousands of families from their homes in Khartoum and used trapped civilians as human shields, while also looting their belongings and destroying critical infrastructure and industrial property. RSF fighters committed heinous, despicable acts, including sexual violence against women, children, and men. This was the first time in Sudan's modern history that such violence was happening in its capital, Khartoum. Many civilians died and millions left. SAF airstrikes against the RSF also caused many civilian casualties. As the initial shock wore off, the population began to support the SAF while being critical of its leadership and demanding they be held accountable for their crimes. Eventually, the SAF largely succeeded in decimating RSF's mutiny, but at a terribly high cost to the Sudanese state, economy, and all sectors of civilian life. The Sudanese revolutionary civilian movement continues to insist that the RSF gets dissolved or fully defeated, and that the SAF return to the barracks after the war is over. The resistance committees also continue to support the Sudanese people with humanitarian relief and in demanding freedom, peace, and justice. Despite the power struggles, the political maneuvers, and the devastation of war, the spirit of the Sudanese people remains unbroken. Thank you for watching this episode. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell button to be notified when our new episode comes out